Hello there, and welcome to the Science for Sleep channel. Tonight we'll explore the myths and mysteries of history, stories that billions of people have believed for centuries, and the quiet, fascinating truths hiding just beneath them. Legends built around famous names, ancient monuments, and everyday phrases that turned out to mean something else entirely. These gentle discoveries have been waiting patiently in the past, holding their secrets while the world repeated the wrong version over and over again. You've got nothing to do but rest. Let your mind relax, your breathing slow, and your body grow easy and still. If this helps you sleep, consider liking and subscribing, one sleepy soul at a time. Now let's begin with the myths of history. Vikings are one of the most famous groups in all of history, and yet one of the most well-known images of them is completely wrong. Almost every picture, movie, or costume shows Viking warriors wearing helmets with large horns sticking out of the sides. It looks dramatic and powerful, and that is exactly why artists in the 1800s started drawing them that way. But real Viking helmets found by archaeologists are simple, rounded, and practical. Horns would have been a terrible idea in real combat, catching on weapons and making the helmet easy to knock off. The famous horned helmet image came from romantic paintings and opera costumes, not from history. The Vikings were fierce and skilled warriors, but they dressed practically, not theatrically. It is a strange thing to think about. One of the most recognized symbols of an entire civilization is almost entirely made up. Napoleon Bonaparte has been the subject of jokes about his height for over 200 years, and almost all of those jokes are based on a mistake. Napoleon was recorded at around 5 feet and 6 or 7 inches tall, which was perfectly average for a Frenchman of his time. The confusion started partly because of British wartime propaganda, which loved to mock him as a tiny, ridiculous figure. It also came from a simple mix-up between French and English measurement systems. French inches were slightly longer than English inches, so when his height was converted, it came out shorter than it really was. His nickname among his soldiers was the Little Corporal, but that was a term of affection, not a comment on his size. It is a reminder of how easily a small error, repeated often enough, can become something that feels like an obvious truth. Many people have heard that humans only use 10% of their brains, and the idea sounds almost inspiring. Imagine what we could do with the other 90%, but this is completely false, and brain science has known it for a long time. Modern brain scans show that we use virtually every part of our brain, and different regions become active depending on what we are doing. Even during deep sleep, large portions of the brain remain busy. There is no silent, unused section waiting to be unlocked. The origin of this myth is unclear, but it may have come from misunderstood research, self-help culture, or the simple human wish that we have untapped potential hiding inside us. Our brains are remarkably active organs, consuming about 20% of our body's total energy, despite making up only about 2% of our body weight. Before Christopher Columbus sailed west in 1492, the story goes that everyone believed the Earth was flat and that he bravely proved them wrong. This is one of the most widespread myths in history, and it is almost entirely invented. Educated people in Europe had known the Earth was round for well over 1,000 years before Columbus was even born. Ancient Greek thinkers had not only understood this, but had also calculated the Earth's circumference with impressive accuracy. Medieval scholars, monks, and university students all learned about a spherical Earth. What Columbus actually disagreed with his critics about was the size of the Earth. And interestingly, his critics were right. He had badly underestimated how large the planet was, and he only survived because the Americas happened to be in the way of his miscalculated route. The Great Wall of China is one of the most incredible structures ever built by human hands, stretching across thousands of miles of mountains and valleys. It is also the subject of one of the most repeated myths about space exploration, that it can be seen from orbit with the naked eye. Astronauts, including Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei, have confirmed that this is not true. The wall is extraordinarily long, but it is only about 15 to 30 feet wide, which makes it far too thin to spot from hundreds of miles above the Earth. Seeing it from space would be like trying to see a single human hair from 2 miles away. The myth likely spread because people wanted to match the wall's legendary scale with an equally legendary claim. The wall is magnificent enough on its own, without needing a story that science has gently but firmly disproven. Albert Einstein has become such a symbol of genius that people have invented stories to make his rise feel more dramatic and relatable. One of the most common is that he failed mathematics as a child, suggesting that even the greatest mind of the 20th century struggled in school. In reality, Einstein excelled at mathematics from a very young age and found it almost effortless. What he did struggle with was the rigid, authoritarian teaching style of the schools he attended, which he found suffocating and dull. He clashed with teachers not because he was slow, but because he was impatient with memorization and rules that seemed to have no deeper meaning. By the time he was 15, he had already mastered calculus. The myth of his failure is actually a hopeful story people invented to make failure feel less frightening, which is understandable, but it simply is not true. When most people picture a Roman gladiator fight, they imagine a brutal spectacle ending with one fighter dead on the sand while the crowd roars. Death was certainly possible, but the idea that gladiators routinely killed each other in every match is a significant exaggeration. Gladiators were highly trained athletes who took years and enormous resources to prepare. Killing them in every fight would have been financially ruinous for the organizers who paid for them. Evidence from historical records and even gladiator graveyards suggests that many fighters survived numerous bouts and lived relatively long careers. The crowd often preferred to see skilled, dramatic combat rather than simple slaughter. A wounded gladiator might be spared based on how bravely he had fought. The image of constant death was magnified by later storytellers, filmmakers, and a natural human fascination with extreme danger. It might seem obvious that people living in the Middle Ages, without modern science or technology, must have believed the Earth was flat. This assumption is so common that the phrase flat earther is used today to describe someone who ignores obvious facts. But medieval educated Europeans almost universally accepted that the Earth was a sphere. The works of ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle were widely read and taught in medieval universities, and they clearly described a round Earth. Medieval theologians and scholars wrote about the spherical Earth without any sense of controversy. Maps from the period sometimes look strange to modern eyes, but they were not made by people who thought the world was flat. They simply had different goals and limited geographic knowledge. The flat Earth Middle Ages is a myth that was largely invented in the 19th century to make religious people look ignorant. Cleopatra is one of the most famous figures from ancient Egypt, and her image is deeply tied to that land. The pyramids, the Nile, the pharaohs. But Cleopatra was almost certainly not Egyptian by ancestry. She was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a royal family that had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years but was originally Greek-Macedonian in origin, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals. Her family had ruled Egypt so long that most of them never even learned the Egyptian language. But Cleopatra herself was remarkable for actually learning it, along with several others. She was a highly educated, politically sharp ruler who used her intelligence and diplomatic skill to protect her kingdom. The image of Cleopatra as purely Egyptian says more about how we like to connect powerful symbols together than about the actual history of who she was. The story of the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock in 1620 is one of the most iconic images in American history. A group of brave travelers stepping off their ship and touching a specific rock on the shore, beginning a new chapter in the story of a nation. The problem is that there is no historical evidence from the time that connects their landing to any particular rock. The rock itself was not identified as the landing spot until more than 100 years after the Mayflower arrived, when an elderly man claimed his father had told him about it. By that point, no one could verify the story. The rock has since been moved, broken, and reassembled multiple times. It became a powerful symbol precisely because people needed one, a concrete, touchable piece of history. But the story behind it is mostly legend built on memory, feeling, and the very human need for a meaningful beginning. For most of human history, life expectancy numbers have told a story that sounds deeply tragic. that people in ancient times or the Middle Ages rarely lived past 30 or 40 years old. This makes the past seem like a world of perpetual youth, where old age was almost unknown. But those numbers are misleading in an important way. The low average life expectancy was driven almost entirely by extremely high rates of death in infancy and early childhood. Diseases, infections, and poor nutrition killed enormous numbers of children before their 5th birthday. But the adults who survived those dangerous early years had a very reasonable chance of living into their 60s or even 70s. Roman records, medieval documents, and ancient bones all show people reaching old age regularly. The average was low because so many died young, not because everyone did. Old people have always existed in human societies, and growing old has always been a familiar part of life. The image of the Roman Emperor Nero playing a fiddle while the great city of Rome burned around him in 64 AD has become one of history's most enduring symbols of cruel indifference. It paints a picture of a leader so disconnected from his people that he turned their disaster into personal entertainment. But the story has two serious problems. First, the fiddle, or violin, was not invented until roughly 1,500 years after Nero's death, making it physically impossible for him to have played one. Second, historical accounts from the time suggest Nero actually responded to the fire with practical relief efforts, opening public buildings to shelter the homeless and organizing food supplies. Some ancient writers do accuse him of starting the fire, but even they describe him as distressed, not entertained. The image of Nero fiddling was created and repeated because it perfectly captured what people already believed about him, not because it was true. Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France before the Revolution, has been remembered for centuries as a symbol of royal excess and indifference to poverty. No phrase captures this image more sharply than "let them eat cake," supposedly her response upon hearing that the poor had no bread. The problem is that there is no solid evidence she ever said it. A very similar phrase appeared in the writings of philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, describing an unnamed princess when Marie Antoinette was just a young child still living in Austria. The quote became attached to her name gradually, driven by the revolution's need for a villain whose cruelty could be illustrated in a single, memorable sentence. Historical research into her actual letters and the accounts of people who knew her suggests she was often genuinely concerned about poverty and was far more complex than the careless queen of legend. Words have a way of finding the faces they fit best, regardless of who actually spoke them. The story of the Trojan horse is one of the oldest and most dramatic tales in Western literature. A giant wooden horse hiding Greek soldiers wheeled inside the walls of Troy, leading to the city's destruction. It comes from ancient Greek poetry and has been retold for nearly 3,000 years. But historians and archaeologists who study the ancient city of Troy have raised interesting questions about whether any of it happened literally. Some scholars suggest the horse may have been a metaphor for a siege machine, possibly a battering ram decorated with a horse's head, as was sometimes done in ancient warfare. Others point to ancient records suggesting a major earthquake struck the region, and that the wooden horse of Poseidon, the god of both horses and earthquakes, was a poetic way of describing that destruction. The literal story may be myth, but the questions it raises about how history becomes legend are genuinely fascinating. Benjamin Franklin was one of the most quoted men in American history, or at least he is one of the most quoted. The problem is that a remarkable number of the clever, witty sayings attributed to him were never actually written or spoken by him at all. Phrases like, "The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results," widely attributed to Franklin, have no connection to him whatsoever. Others were written by contemporaries and only drifted toward Franklin's name over time, perhaps because he was already famous for clever sayings, and his name added authority. The internet has made this problem significantly worse, turning dubious attributions into viral certainties within hours. Franklin did write a great deal, and many of his real words are genuinely sharp and worth remembering. But the Franklin of popular culture has become something of a fictional character, a wise, endlessly quotable founding father whose mouth has been filled with other people's words for centuries. George Washington's teeth are almost as famous as he is. The story that he wore dentures carved from a single block of wood has been repeated in classrooms, books, and conversations for generations. It sounds just plausible enough to stick. Wood was everywhere in colonial America after all. But Washington's actual dentures, some of which still survive and have been studied by historians and dentists, were made from a combination of materials including ivory from hippopotamus and elephant tusks, human teeth purchased or extracted from enslaved people, and animal teeth from cows and horses. The construction was held together with metal springs and wires. They were painful, ill-fitting, and caused him considerable discomfort throughout his presidency, which may explain why he so rarely smiled in portraits. Wood was never part of their construction. The wooden teeth story may have begun as a simple misremembering, but it has proved far more durable than the real, stranger, and more uncomfortable truth. The Iron Maiden is one of the most recognizable objects from the history of torture. A human-shaped metal cabinet lined with iron spikes, supposedly used in the Middle Ages to execute prisoners in a slow and horrifying way. It appears in museums, movies, and history books as evidence of medieval cruelty. But many historians now believe the Iron Maiden was never actually used as a torture device at all. The most famous example, displayed in a Nuremberg museum in the 1800s, appears to have been assembled from unrelated medieval artifacts and presented as a single instrument to satisfy the public's appetite for dramatic history. No medieval documents describe its use, and the spike placement in most examples would have caused immediate death rather than slow torture, which would have defeated its supposed purpose. It seems to be less a window into medieval brutality and more a reflection of the 19th century's fascination with imagining the past as more horrifying than it actually was. The gunfight at high noon, two men facing each other on a dusty street, hands hovering over their holsters, waiting for the clock to strike 12, is one of the most powerful images in all of American mythology. It comes from Western films, novels, and television shows that defined how an entire era of history looked and felt in the popular imagination. Real violence in the American frontier was almost nothing like this. Actual confrontations between gunmen were typically sudden, chaotic, messy, and short, with little of the theatrical ceremony that movies made famous. Records from frontier towns show that formal duels of this kind were extremely rare, and that most deadly incidents involved ambushes, arguments in saloons, or shootings from behind. The frontier was dangerous in real and unglamorous ways, but the elegant drama of the high noon showdown was largely invented by storytellers who understood that audiences preferred romance over reality. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria is one of history's great dramatic moments, a single catastrophic event in which the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world was lost forever in a single night of fire. The story has been told countless times, with different villains assigned depending on who is telling it. Julius Caesar, a Christian mob, a Muslim caliph. The truth is far less dramatic, but in some ways more melancholy. The library did not die in one night. It declined slowly over several centuries through a combination of reduced royal funding, political instability, the changing nature of book culture, and yes, some fires and violence along the way. Ancient knowledge was not stored in a single building that could be burned all at once. It was spread across many copies, many cities, and many institutions. What was lost happened gradually through neglect and the slow erosion of the systems that had supported learning, rather than in one terrible, unforgettable blaze. The apple that supposedly fell on Isaac Newton's head and instantly gave him the idea of gravity has become one of science's most beloved origin stories. It is clean, memorable, and almost perfectly designed to teach children that great ideas can come from simple observations. Newton himself told a version involving an apple falling in an orchard, but even in his own telling, it was not a sudden moment of inspiration. It was one of many observations that pointed him toward questions he had already been thinking about for years. The full development of his theory of gravitation took enormous intellectual work spread across decades. The dramatic apple was likely a simplified story he told later in life. to give a neat beginning to something far more complicated. Science rarely works through single magical moments of revelation. It moves through years of careful thought, dead ends, corrections, and gradual understanding, which is less exciting to tell at dinner but far closer to the truth. Roman soldiers are among the most depicted warriors in all of history, appearing in countless films, television series, paintings, and novels. The image is remarkably consistent: shining armor, red capes, perfectly ordered formations marching across sunlit landscapes. But the reality of the Roman army was far more varied and complex than any movie has ever shown. Soldiers came from all across the enormous Roman Empire, bringing different languages, traditions, weapons, and fighting styles with them. Equipment changed dramatically across the centuries and differed by region, rank, and the type of unit a soldier belonged to. Many soldiers spent most of their careers doing construction work, building roads, bridges, and walls rather than fighting. Their daily lives involved paperwork, farming, trade, and long stretches of routine. The gleaming, uniform Hollywood legionnaire is a useful symbol, but the real Roman soldier was a far more ordinary, complicated, and surprisingly bureaucratic human being. The Salem witch trials of 1692 are remembered as a moment of mass hysteria, driven by genuine belief in witchcraft and supernatural evil. Young girls accused neighbors of sending their spirits to torment them, and the community responded with fear and deadly seriousness. But historians who have studied the trials in detail have found that the causes were far more grounded in very human and earthly concerns. Long-standing property disputes between families played a significant role, with accusations often falling along the lines of existing social and economic conflicts. There is also a widely discussed theory that a fungus called ergot, which grows on rye grain and causes hallucinations and convulsions, may have contributed to the strange symptoms the afflicted girls reported. Social tension, political instability, harsh winters, and the pressures of Puritan religious life all created conditions where fear could easily spiral into catastrophe. Witchcraft provided a framework for explaining what people could not otherwise understand. One of the most persistent myths about ancient Egypt is that the Great Pyramids were built by slaves. Thousands of miserable people whipped and driven to exhaustion in service of a pharaoh's vanity. This image was partly shaped by the biblical story of Hebrew slaves in Egypt and was reinforced by centuries of dramatic retellings. But archaeological discoveries over the past few decades have told a strikingly different story. Excavations near the pyramid sites uncovered the remains of a workers' village complete with bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, and cemeteries. Analysis of the workers' bones showed signs of healed injuries, suggesting they received medical care. Inscriptions found nearby show that workers were organized into named teams with a sense of pride in their labor. They appear to have been paid workers drawn from across Egypt, fed well, and honored after death. The pyramids were not just monuments to royal power. They were also a national project that gave work, meaning, and community to the people who built them. Walt Disney created one of the most beloved entertainment empires in history. And after his death in December 1966, a strange story began to circulate. According to the legend, Disney had arranged to have his body cryogenically frozen, preserved at extremely low temperatures in hopes of being revived by future medicine. It was exactly the kind of forward-thinking, imaginative gesture that fit his public image as a man who always believed in tomorrow. But the story is simply not true. Disney died of lung cancer and was cremated just 2 days after his death, on December 17, 1966. His ashes were interred at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California. The first known cryogenic preservation of a human body did not happen until January 1967, more than a month after Disney died. The myth appeared sometime in the 1970s and has proved almost impossible to kill, perhaps because it is so perfectly suited to the man who built a career on magical impossibilities. The custom of saying "bless you" after someone sneezes is so automatic in many cultures that most people never stop to wonder where it came from. One popular explanation claims that people in the Middle Ages believed the soul could escape the body during a sneeze, and that "bless you" was said to protect the sneezer from losing their spirit or letting the devil in. This makes for a charming story, but historians have found no solid medieval sources supporting this specific belief as the origin of the phrase. The blessing after a sneeze appears in many cultures and time periods, with a wide variety of explanations attached to it. Some historians connect it to the idea that sneezing was an early sign of illness during plague times. Others suggest it was simply a polite acknowledgement, similar to other everyday courtesies. The soul-escaping explanation may itself be a relatively modern story, invented to give a mysterious and ancient-feeling origin to something far more ordinary. The extinction of the dinosaurs is one of the great dramatic events in the history of life on Earth, and many people picture a world where humans and dinosaurs just barely missed each other in time. Movies and stories have played with this idea. What if they had overlapped? What if some survived in hidden valleys? The truth is that non-bird dinosaurs disappeared approximately 66 million years ago, when a massive asteroid struck the Earth and triggered catastrophic environmental changes. The earliest members of the human lineage did not appear until roughly 6 or 7 million years ago at the earliest, and modern humans like us have only existed for about 300,000 years. The gap between the last dinosaurs and the first humans is almost incomprehensibly large, longer than the entire age of the dinosaurs themselves. We are not separated from them by a near miss. We are separated by a gulf of time so vast it is almost impossible to truly imagine. Human blood has a talent for inspiring myths, and one of the most widespread is the idea that the blood flowing through your veins is blue. It seems to make sense. Veins visible through pale skin do appear distinctly blue or greenish, and many diagrams in biology textbooks color veins blue to distinguish them from arteries. But blood is always red, regardless of whether it is carrying oxygen or not. Blood that has delivered its oxygen to the body's tissues becomes a darker, less vivid shade of red rather than the bright crimson of freshly oxygenated blood. The blue appearance of veins under the skin is an optical effect created by the way different wavelengths of light penetrate and reflect through layers of skin and tissue. Blue light does not travel as deeply into skin as red light does, which changes what your eye perceives at the surface. Your blood has never been blue for even a single moment of your life. The Roman Colosseum stands today as one of the most recognizable buildings in the world, a symbol of ancient power, engineering genius, and, in most people's minds, gladiatorial combat. The connection between the Colosseum and gladiator fights is so strong that it is hard to imagine the building being used for anything else. But the Colosseum hosted a remarkable variety of events across its centuries of use. Animal hunts, called venaciones, brought lions, elephants, bears, and exotic creatures from across the empire into the arena. Public executions were staged there, sometimes elaborately theatrical. There were dramatic reenactments of famous battles and mythological scenes. Early in its history, the arena floor could reportedly be flooded for mock naval battles, though historians debate how practical this actually was. Gladiatorial combat was certainly part of its history, but the Colosseum was something closer to a multi-purpose entertainment venue than a single-purpose fighting pit. The story that Julius Caesar was born by the surgical procedure that bears his name has the appeal of a neat historical coincidence. A man defined by his cutting decisiveness, delivered into the world by a blade. But the Caesarean section in ancient Rome was performed only when the mother had already died, or was dying, as a last attempt to save the child. Caesar's mother, Aurelia, was very much alive during his childhood and reportedly remained a major influence on his life and education well into his adult years. She is believed to have lived until around 54 BC, when Caesar was already in his mid-40s. The actual origin of the term Caesarean is debated, with some historians tracing it to a Latin word meaning to cut, rather than to any connection with Julius Caesar personally. The story is a perfect example of how a name can generate its own mythology, filling in a dramatic backstory that the facts never actually provided. The word medieval carries a heavy burden in popular culture. It has become almost synonymous with ignorance, cruelty, superstition, and darkness. A long pause in human progress between the glory of ancient Rome and the light of the Renaissance. The phrase, "that's so medieval," is used as an insult precisely because of these associations. But the actual Middle Ages, spanning roughly 1,000 years across an enormous geographic area, were far more varied and productive than this reputation suggests. Gothic cathedrals of staggering engineering complexity were built during this period. Universities appeared for the first time in European history. Agricultural improvements fed growing populations. Islamic scholars preserved and expanded ancient knowledge in mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. Art, music, and literature flourished in courts and monasteries across the continent. The image of the Dark Ages as a time of pure ignorance was largely constructed by Renaissance thinkers who wanted to make their own era look more impressive. By contrast, ninjas are one of the most mythologized figures in all of popular culture. Black-clad warriors leaping across rooftops, disappearing in puffs of smoke, armed with throwing stars and moving with impossible silence. The image is so vivid and so consistent across movies, cartoons, and video games that it feels like it must be rooted in real history. The actual historical shinobi were something far less theatrical. They were primarily agents of espionage, sabotage, and intelligence gathering in feudal Japan. Their most important skill was not acrobatics or combat, but the ability to blend in completely with ordinary people, farmers, merchants, monks, or travelers. A shinobi dressed in black to sneak across rooftops would have been immediately suspicious. Their real power came from patience, disguise, information, and the ability to move through a world without being noticed. The dramatic ninja of popular culture tells us more about the entertainment industry's love of spectacle than about the quiet, careful people who actually practice this craft. The samurai code, known as Bushido, is spoken of as an ancient and unchanging warrior philosophy, a timeless set of rules about loyalty, honor, and self-sacrifice that guided Japanese warriors for centuries. It has inspired books, films, and philosophical movements around the world, and is often presented as one of the defining features of Japanese culture. But historians who study feudal Japan carefully have pointed out that the formal, written code called Bushido was largely developed and romanticized in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, during a period when Japan was rapidly modernizing and felt a strong need to construct a heroic national identity. The actual behavior of samurai throughout history was far more varied, practical, and morally complicated than the idealized code suggests. Real samurai switched loyalties, pursued personal interests, engaged in politics and commerce, and behaved in all the contradictory ways that real human beings in positions of power tend to behave. King Arthur is one of the most enduring figures in all of Western storytelling. The wise and noble king of Camelot, the sword in the stone, the round table, the knights riding out on quests for truth and justice. The stories have been told and retold for over 1,000 years and show no sign of fading. But when historians and archaeologists go looking for a real King Arthur who ruled Britain in the 5th or 6th century, they find almost nothing. No contemporary documents from that period mention him. No archaeological site has been firmly connected to Camelot or his court. The Arthur of legend appears to have grown from a collection of older Celtic stories, possibly combined with a vague memory of a real post-Roman military leader whose actual name and deeds have been long lost. What survives is not history but something more powerful, a story so perfectly shaped to human hopes and values that it has outlasted any need for factual foundation. Thomas Edison is remembered as one of the greatest inventors in American history, and his name is permanently attached to the light bulb in a way that feels as natural as the light itself. The story told in schools is wonderfully simple. Edison had an idea, worked tirelessly through thousands of failed experiments, and finally lit up the world. The reality is considerably more complicated. By the time Edison began his work on the light bulb in the late 1870s, other inventors had already demonstrated working electric lights, including Humphrey Davy decades earlier and Joseph Swan in England, who developed a practical bulb around the same time as Edison. What Edison actually did, which was genuinely remarkable, was develop not just a better bulb, but an entire commercial electrical system, including generators, wiring, and distribution networks that made electric light practical for ordinary homes and businesses. His genius was as much organizational and commercial as it was inventive. Christopher Columbus has been celebrated for centuries as the man who discovered America, a brave explorer who sailed into the unknown and found a new world. The problems with this story are numerous and significant. To begin with, the Americas were home to tens of millions of people when Columbus arrived. Civilizations with cities, agriculture, art, science, and history stretching back thousands of years. These people had most certainly discovered America long before anyone else. Furthermore, Norse explorer Leif Erikson and his crew established a settlement in what is now Newfoundland, Canada, roughly 500 years before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. Columbus himself never set foot on the mainland of North America, landing instead on Caribbean islands and the coast of Central and South America. He also died believing he had reached Asia and never publicly acknowledged that he had found continents previously unknown to Europeans. The discovery story is really a story about Europe's encounter with a world that had been thriving without it for millennia. The conquest of the Aztec Empire by Spanish explorer Hernán Cortés in the early 16th century has often been explained through a dramatic and convenient story. That the Aztecs initially welcomed Cortés and his men as gods, specifically because their arrival seemed to fulfill a prophecy about the return of the feathered serpent deity Quetzalcoatl. This story made the conquest seem almost inevitable, even mystical, as though the Aztecs were defeated partly by their own beliefs. But historians who have studied the original sources carefully have found that this account was largely constructed after the conquest, mostly by Spanish writers who wanted to portray the Aztec submission as willing and divinely ordained. The Aztecs were sophisticated diplomats and military strategists who initially attempted negotiation and alliance before resorting to resistance. The God story served the conqueror's narrative far better than it served the truth, providing a tidy explanation for a conquest that actually involved years of brutal warfare, shifting alliances, and devastating disease. The chastity belt, a locked metal device supposedly worn by women in the Middle Ages while their husbands went off to war, has appeared in countless historical dramas, comedy sketches, and museum displays as a symbol of medieval attitudes toward women and control. Many people assume it was a common feature of medieval life, but most historians who have examined the evidence closely believe that chastity belts were not actually used in the Middle Ages in any widespread way. The devices that exist in museum collections today appear to date from the Renaissance period at the earliest, and many were likely made in the 18th and 19th centuries as curiosities or novelties for collectors who enjoyed imagining a dramatically brutal medieval past. No reliable medieval documents describe their regular use. Like the Iron Maiden, the chastity belt seems to be more a product of later generations' fantasies about the past than a genuine artifact of the period it supposedly represents. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, signed on January 1, 1863, is remembered as the moment when Lincoln freed the enslaved people of America. A sweeping moral declaration that ended one of history's greatest injustices in a single stroke of the pen. The reality of the document was considerably more limited and politically calculated than this memory suggests. The proclamation applied only to enslaved people in Confederate states that were still in rebellion, meaning the states where Lincoln's government had no actual power to enforce it. Enslaved people in border states that had remained loyal to the Union were not freed by the proclamation at all. Lincoln himself acknowledged privately that the order was primarily a war measure designed to weaken the Confederacy and encourage enslaved people to abandon their enslavers. The full legal abolition of slavery in the United States required the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in December 1865, nearly 2 years after the proclamation that history remembers as the moment of freedom. Socrates is considered one of the founding figures of Western philosophy, and his ideas about knowledge, virtue, and the examined life have shaped human thought for 2,500 years. His famous method of questioning, his trial and death, and his profound influence on his students are all well documented, or so it seems. The striking reality is that Socrates himself wrote nothing. Not a single word that can be confirmed as coming directly from him has survived. Everything we believe we know about Socrates comes through other writers, primarily his student Plato, who used Socrates as the main character in his philosophical dialogues. But Plato was not writing biography. He was writing philosophy, and historians have long debated how much of the Socrates in Plato's dialogues represents the real man and how much represents Plato's own developing ideas placed in a famous mouth. The most influential philosopher in Western history may be, to a significant degree, a literary character. The phrase, "pulling yourself up by your bootstraps," has become one of the most common expressions in discussions about self-reliance, hard work, and individual achievement. It is used to celebrate people who succeed without help and to suggest that anyone can improve their situation through effort alone. But the original meaning of the phrase was precisely the opposite. It was used to describe something physically impossible. Bootstraps are the small loops on the back of boots used to help pull them on, and the image of lifting yourself off the ground by pulling on your own bootstraps was originally a joke about attempting the absurd. You cannot lift yourself by pulling on your own feet. The phrase appeared in various forms in the 19th century as a metaphor for a logical impossibility, similar to trying to think your way out of your own mind. Somewhere along the way, the impossible became inspirational, and a joke about futility became one of the most repeated pieces of motivational wisdom in the English language. Ancient Romans have a reputation in popular culture for spectacular excess. Lavish dinner parties where guests ate until they were full, then retreated to a special room to empty their stomachs and return to eating again. This room, supposedly called a vomitorium, has become one of the most repeated details in casual conversations about Roman history. The truth is both simpler and slightly disappointing. A vomitorium was indeed a real Roman word, but it referred to the wide passageways in amphitheaters and stadiums through which large crowds could quickly exit. Essentially a crowd flow corridor, not a purging chamber. The word comes from the Latin for to spew forth, describing people pouring out of a building rather than anything digestive. While some ancient Roman writers did describe wealthy people eating to excess at lavish banquets, the dedicated purging room as a standard feature of Roman dining culture appears to have been a misunderstanding that grew into legend. The Romans had many real excesses worth discussing without needing to invent fictional ones. Niccolò Machiavelli has been so thoroughly transformed into a symbol of cold, calculating evil that his very name became an adjective. To call someone Machiavellian is to suggest they are devious, manipulative, and completely without moral principle. This reputation rests almost entirely on his short political work called The Prince, written in 1513, which describes with unflinching honesty how rulers actually maintain power, through fear, deception, and ruthless pragmatism when necessary. But reading only The Prince, while ignoring the rest of Machiavelli's work, gives a deeply distorted picture of the man. His longer and more celebrated work, The Discourses on Livy, reveals a thinker who genuinely believed in republican government, civic participation, and the importance of an engaged citizenry. He was also a diplomat, a playwright, and a man who endured imprisonment and torture for his political beliefs. The villain of popular imagination was in reality a complex political philosopher trying to understand and describe power in a dangerous world. The 100 Years' War between England and France is one of the most famous conflicts in medieval history, invoked constantly in discussions of medieval warfare, chivalry, and the story of Joan of Arc. Its name implies a tidy, century-long conflict with a clear beginning and end. But the war actually lasted approximately 116 years, from 1337 to 1453, which is already more than the name suggests. Beyond the length, it was not really a single continuous war at all, but rather a series of separate conflicts, truces, alliances, and renewed hostilities that historians have grouped together under one convenient label. There were long periods of relative peace within those years, and the fighting involved constantly shifting alliances among French noble factions as much as it involved England and France facing each other directly. The neat name was applied retrospectively by historians who needed a way to describe a complicated, messy, and drawn-out series of events that resisted simple summary. The Black Death, which swept across Europe and Asia in the mid-14th century, is most commonly remembered through the image of rats carrying infected fleas through city streets. Rats and fleas were certainly involved in the transmission of bubonic plague, which was one major form of the disease, and this part of the story is scientifically supported. But the full picture of how the Black Death spread is considerably more complex. Pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs, could spread directly between people through respiratory droplets, requiring no rat or flea at all. Septicemic plague entered the bloodstream and could spread through direct contact with infected blood. Recent genetic and historical research has suggested that the epidemic spread far more rapidly than rat-flea transmission alone could account for, pointing to multiple routes of infection operating simultaneously. The rats absorbed almost all of the blame in the cultural memory of the plague, which was convenient, but incomplete. The disease was a more versatile and terrifying killer than any single transmission route can explain. Marco Polo's account of his travels through Asia in the 13th century is one of the most famous travel narratives ever written, describing the wonders of China, the court of Kublai Khan, and a world utterly unlike the Europe he came from. It shaped European understanding of Asia for centuries and inspired explorers including Christopher Columbus. But a small and persistent group of historians has raised serious questions about whether Marco Polo actually made the journey he described. His book, dictated to a writer while Polo was in prison, contains remarkable details about Chinese culture and geography. But it also omits things a careful observer would surely have noticed, including the Chinese custom of drinking tea, the practice of foot binding, the use of chopsticks, and the existence of the Great Wall. Chinese records from the period, which documented foreign visitors meticulously, contain no mention of him. Some historians suggest he may have compiled his account from other travelers' stories and Persian and Arab geographical sources rather than from his own direct experience. The nose of the Great Sphinx of Giza is one of ancient Egypt's most famous missing features. A broad, flat face staring across the desert with a conspicuous gap where the nose should be. For many years, a popular story attributed its destruction to Napoleon's soldiers, who supposedly used the Sphinx for target practice during the French campaign in Egypt in 1798. The story fits a narrative of European colonialism damaging the ancient world, and it has been repeated widely. But detailed drawings and engravings of the Sphinx made by European travelers who visited Egypt before Napoleon's expedition clearly show the nose already missing. Some historians point to a 14th century account describing a religious leader named Muhammad Sa'im al-Dar, who reportedly damaged the face out of opposition to the offerings being made to it. The actual cause of the damage remains somewhat uncertain, but Napoleon's soldiers were most certainly not responsible. The timeline alone makes the popular story impossible. Nikola Tesla is one of history's great figures of both scientific achievement and personal tragedy, a man whose contributions to electrical engineering were enormous and whose later years were marked by poverty, isolation, and unfunded dreams. The narrative of Tesla dying completely forgotten and ignored has become central to the way he is celebrated today, particularly in internet culture, where he is often portrayed as a misunderstood genius erased from history by powerful rivals. The reality is more nuanced. Tesla was genuinely celebrated during his lifetime and was a famous public figure for many years. His conflict with Thomas Edison was real, but it was a commercial and technical dispute between two prominent men, not a simple story of a hero being crushed by a villain. His later years were genuinely difficult, marked by mental health struggles, financial mismanagement, and increasingly impractical ambitions. He died in 1943 with his greatest ideas unfunded, but not unknown. His legacy was already being discussed seriously in scientific and engineering communities at the time of his death. Charles Darwin changed the way human beings understand life on Earth, and his name is permanently linked to the theory of evolution. But the common understanding that Darwin single-handedly invented the idea of evolution from scratch, delivering it to a world that had never considered such a thing, is not quite accurate. Ideas about species changing over time had been circulating in scientific and philosophical circles for decades before Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. His own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had written about transformations in living things. French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck had proposed a formal theory of species transformation decades earlier. What Darwin contributed, and it was a genuinely revolutionary contribution, was a detailed, evidenced, and mechanistically convincing explanation for how evolution worked through the process of natural selection. He also developed his theory independently and simultaneously with Alfred Russel Wallace, who came to almost identical conclusions at almost the same time, which prompted Darwin to finally publish work he had been sitting on for over 20 years. The rule of thumb is one of those phrases so embedded in everyday language that most people never question where it came from. A widely circulated story claims the phrase originated in English common law, which supposedly permitted a husband to beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb. This makes the phrase sound like a grim fossil of historical misogyny, hiding in plain sight within ordinary speech. But legal historians have searched extensively through English and American legal records and have found no such law. The phrase appears in writings from the 17th century onward as a simple reference to practical measurement using the thumb as a rough unit, the way craftsmen and farmers would use body parts for quick estimates before precise tools were available. The wife-beating origin story appears to have been invented or significantly embellished in the 20th century, possibly arising from a misreading of a court case. The phrase's real origin is mundane, but the false origin has proved far more memorable and far harder to correct. Galileo Galilei stands in popular history as the great martyr of science, a man who bravely declared that the earth moves around the sun and was ruthlessly imprisoned by the Catholic Church for daring to challenge religious authority with truth. This story is real in its broad outlines, but significantly distorted in its details. Galileo was not imprisoned in a dark cell. He was placed under comfortable house arrest at a villa in Arcetri, where he continued his scientific work until his death. His conflict with the Church was complicated by personal factors, including his own argumentative personality, his mockery of church officials in his published writings, and the fact that the Pope, who eventually condemned him, had previously been his supporter and friend. The Church's objection was also partly about authority and process. Galileo was told to present heliocentrism as a hypothesis rather than a proven fact, which it technically still was at the time. The story of pure science versus pure religion flattens a far messier and more human confrontation. Ancient people are sometimes imagined as dreamers who could not clearly separate the world of sleep from the world of waking. Primitive minds wandering through reality and vision without firm boundaries between the two. This picture of ancient consciousness as confused or childlike is itself a kind of myth. Civilizations across the ancient world developed rich and sophisticated frameworks for understanding dreams that were far more nuanced than simple confusion. Ancient Egyptians, Greeks, Mesopotamians, and Chinese thinkers all distinguished carefully between ordinary dreams, meaningful dreams, and waking reality. They debated the origins of dreams, cataloged their possible meanings, and built entire traditions of interpretation around them. The famous dream temples of ancient Greece, where people slept in sacred spaces hoping for healing visions, were not evidence of confusion, but of a deliberate and thoughtful engagement with the sleeping mind. Ancient people understood perfectly well that they were asleep when they dreamed. They simply believed, as many people still do, that sleep might open doors worth paying attention to. The Great Fire of London in 1666 is one of the most dramatic events in the city's long history. 4 days of burning that destroyed thousands of buildings, including the original St. Paul's Cathedral, and reshaped the medieval city entirely. Given the scale of the destruction, most people assume the fire must have killed enormous numbers of people, sweeping through crowded streets and leaving mass casualties behind. The official death toll recorded at the time, however, is remarkably small. Only 6 deaths are formally documented in contemporary records. Historians have debated whether this number is accurate, suggesting that deaths among the poor and homeless may have gone unrecorded. and that some people may have died later from injuries, illness, or exposure without being connected to the fire in official documents. But even accounting for these possibilities, the fire appears to have been far less deadly than its scale of destruction suggests. Most Londoners had time to flee, carrying what they could, watching their city burn from a distance while their lives remained intact. Albert Einstein is one of the most famous scientists in history, and the details of his life have been picked over, mythologized, and occasionally fabricated to a remarkable degree. One genuine and somewhat surprising fact is that Einstein was formally offered the presidency of the newly established State of Israel in 1952, following the death of Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann. The offer was made through the Israeli ambassador in Washington and was a sincere recognition of Einstein's symbolic importance to Jewish culture and intellectual life worldwide. Einstein declined, writing a letter that was gracious but honest. He said he lacked the natural aptitude for dealing with people in the formal ways that leadership required, and that at 73 years old, he felt his health and temperament made him unsuitable for the role. He expressed deep feeling for the State of Israel and genuine regret that he could not serve in this way. It is one of those historical moments that sounds almost too strange to be true, yet is thoroughly documented and entirely real. The ancient Olympic Games are remembered today through the lens of their modern revival, a celebration of athletic excellence, international friendship, and peaceful competition held every 4 years. The concept of an Olympic truce, during which wars were supposed to pause so that athletes and spectators could travel safely to Olympia, is often cited as evidence that the ancient Greeks valued sport above conflict. The reality was considerably more complicated. The truce, known as the Ekacheria, did protect travelers going to and from Olympia, but it did not actually stop wars from happening elsewhere. Conflicts continued during Olympic years with regularity, and city-states sometimes violated even the limited protections the truce was supposed to provide. The games themselves were also not the peaceful gathering of all Greeks that modern imagination suggests. They were deeply political events tied to religious ceremony, civic competition, and the display of power and wealth. The peaceful Olympics is a beautiful ideal, but the ancient version was embedded in a world that rarely paused for beauty. Medieval castles occupy a particular place in the imagination. Cold, gray, damp fortresses of stone, filled with drafty corridors, flickering torchlight, and an atmosphere of permanent gloom. This image is so pervasive in films, novels, and games that it feels almost factual. But the castles that survive today are stripped of almost everything that made them habitable and often colorful places to live. Archaeological and historical research has revealed that the interior walls of many medieval castles were plastered and painted in vivid colors, reds, blues, yellows, and greens, with elaborate decorative patterns and scenes from stories and history. Floors were covered with rushes, tapestries, and carpets. Fireplaces and carefully designed window placements managed light and heat with considerable sophistication. Great halls were designed for feasting, music, and social gathering. The bare stone ruin we visit today is not the castle as it was lived in. It is the skeleton of a building whose flesh, color, and warmth have simply been stripped away by centuries of abandonment and weathering. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter is one of archaeology's most famous moments, and the death of expedition sponsor Lord Carnarvon just a few months later gave birth to one of history's most enduring curses. The Mummy's Curse, supposedly a supernatural punishment inscribed in the tomb to punish those who disturbed the pharaoh's rest, quickly became a worldwide sensation in the press and has never entirely faded from popular culture. But the facts are stubbornly uncooperative with the legend. Lord Carnarvon died of blood poisoning from an infected mosquito bite, a perfectly ordinary cause of death for a man traveling in Egypt in 1923. Howard Carter himself, who actually opened the tomb and would presumably have been the curse's primary target, lived for another 17 years. Studies examining the death rates of everyone who entered the tomb found no statistically unusual pattern compared to similar groups of the same age and time period. The curse was not carved into the tomb walls. It was written by newspapers looking for a story. Isaac Newton is remembered almost entirely as a physicist and mathematician, the man who described gravity, invented calculus, and laid the foundations of classical mechanics. These achievements are real and extraordinary, but they represent only a fraction of what Newton actually spent his time thinking about and writing. Newton devoted enormous amounts of his life to subjects that most people would find deeply surprising. He wrote over 1,000,000 words on alchemy, the attempt to transform one substance into another, including the legendary search for a way to make gold. He also wrote extensively on biblical prophecy, theological interpretation, and the hidden chronology of history as encoded in Scripture. He believed that the ancient world contained secret knowledge that could be decoded through careful study. These were not private hobbies he was embarrassed about. They were serious intellectual pursuits that he considered connected to his scientific work. The purely rational Newton of popular legend is a selective portrait of a man who was also, in many ways, a mystic. The ancient Greeks had a word, mythos, that simply meant story or narrative. It carried no automatic implication of falsehood, fantasy, or primitive thinking. A mythos could be a sacred story, a traditional account, a poetic explanation, or a historical narrative. The modern meaning of the word myth, which implies something false or mistaken, is a later development that would have puzzled a Greek hearing their own word used that way. Greek thinkers themselves debated the status of their myths. Some treated them as literal accounts of real events, others as poetic allegories for deeper truths, and others as simply inherited stories worth examining critically. Plato himself used myths as philosophical tools, inventing new ones when he needed them. The relationship between ancient Greeks and their mythological tradition was far more sophisticated and self-aware than the image of credulous people literally believing in gods and monsters would suggest. They were not confused about the difference between story and fact. They simply had a different and arguably richer relationship with both. The image of early humans crouching in dark caves, barely surviving, grunting at each other without real language or thought, has been slowly but thoroughly dismantled by decades of archaeological discovery. The oldest known cave paintings, found in sites across Europe, Africa, and Asia, demonstrate not just artistic skill, but symbolic thinking, the ability to represent the world through images, to tell stories, and to communicate across time. Flutes carved from bone show that early humans made music. Burial sites with carefully arranged flowers and objects suggest beliefs about death and the possibility of something beyond it. Shell beads and ochre pigments found at sites over 70,000 years old show that people adorned themselves and cared about appearance. The cognitive and creative distance between early modern humans and people alive today is far smaller than the popular image of the grunting cave dweller suggests. Our ancestors were fully human in mind and feeling, living in a world that was harder and stranger than ours, but meeting it with the same essential human curiosity. History is always written by someone, shaped by the language, culture, politics, and personal interests of the person holding the pen. This fact is not a conspiracy theory or a radical idea, but a straightforward observation that historians have grappled with for as long as the discipline has existed. Every historical record was created by a human being with a perspective, a purpose, and things they chose not to say as well as things they chose to include. Ancient rulers commissioned accounts of their own victories and rarely preserved careful records of their defeats. Medieval monks copied and preserved certain texts while allowing others to disappear. Colonial administrators described the peoples they encountered through frameworks built entirely from their own cultural assumptions. This does not mean history is unknowable or that all accounts are equally unreliable. It means that reading history well requires asking not just what happened, but who recorded it, why they recorded it, and whose story was never told at all. The legend of the first marathon traces back to a Greek soldier named Phidippides, who supposedly ran from the battlefield of Marathon to Athens, a distance of about 26 miles, announced the Greek victory over the Persians with the word, "We have won," and then immediately collapsed and died. It is one of the most dramatic origin stories in all of sports history, and it gave the modern marathon race both its distance and its romantic mythology. But the historical account is more complicated and considerably less tidy. The ancient historian Herodotus, writing closest to the actual events, describes Pheidippides as a professional long-distance runner who was sent not from Marathon to Athens but from Athens all the way to Sparta, a journey of roughly 150 miles each way, to request military assistance before the battle. The famous short run and dramatic death appears in a later account written centuries after the events. Whether Pheidippides ran 26 miles or hundreds, the story of a single fatal sprint, delivering a single word of victory, is almost certainly a later embellishment, shaped more by the desire for a perfect story than by what actually happened. Stonehenge stands on the Salisbury Plain in England as one of the most mysterious and recognizable structures in the world. A circle of enormous standing stones arranged with a precision that still impresses engineers today. For generations, popular culture connected Stonehenge directly to the Druids, the priestly class of ancient Celtic peoples, imagining white-robed figures gathering at the stones for ceremonies at midsummer and midwinter. Modern Druid groups do gather at Stonehenge for solstice celebrations, and the site has become genuinely meaningful to contemporary practitioners. But the actual construction of Stonehenge began approximately 5,000 years ago, and its main phases were completed roughly 3,500 years ago. The Druids, as a recognizable cultural and religious group, appear in historical records only from around the time of Julius Caesar, roughly 2,000 years ago. This means Stonehenge was already ancient, already mysterious, and possibly already abandoned when the Druids first appeared in recorded history. The stones predate the Druids by at least 1,000 years. Latin is often described as the language of ancient Rome, the tongue in which senators debated, legions marched, and emperors issued their decrees. This is true in the sense that Latin was the official administrative and literary language of the Roman Empire. But the Roman Empire was an enormous and extraordinarily diverse place, stretching from Britain in the northwest to Mesopotamia in the east, and encompassing hundreds of different peoples, cultures, and languages within its borders. In the eastern half of the empire, Greek was actually the dominant language of educated life, commerce, and administration, and many emperors were more comfortable in Greek than in Latin. Ordinary people across the empire spoke regional languages, Celtic dialects in Gaul and Britain, Aramaic in the Middle East, Berber languages in North Africa, Egyptian in Egypt. Latin was the language of power and prestige, but the streets of the Roman Empire rang with a vast chorus of other tongues that official records rarely bothered to preserve. The empire was linguistically as complex as any modern continent. The Great Pyramid of Giza is so familiar, reproduced on currency, logos, and countless images, that most people feel they know exactly what it looks like. The golden brown, slightly rough-textured stone surface seems as natural and permanent as the pyramid's shape itself. But the pyramid we see today is not the pyramid that was built. When it was completed around 2560 BC, the Great Pyramid was encased in a smooth outer layer of highly polished white Tura limestone, fitted together with extraordinary precision so that the joints were nearly invisible. In bright Egyptian sunlight, this surface would have reflected light brilliantly, making the pyramid visible from enormous distances across the desert. Ancient texts describe it gleaming like a jewel. Over the centuries, much of this outer casing was quarried away and used for building projects in Cairo, leaving the rough inner core exposed. The pyramid we photograph today is not a finished monument. It is a stripped-down structure, impressive enough in its current state, but a shadow of the blinding, luminous object that first rose above the Egyptian desert. The idea that every generation believes the world was better and simpler in the past is not just a casual observation. It is one of the most consistent patterns in recorded human history. Ancient Greek and Roman writers described their own times as corrupt and degraded, compared to a lost golden age of virtue and simplicity. Medieval writers mourned the decline from earlier Christian purity. Victorian writers lamented the loss of an organic, pre-industrial way of life. Writers today worry about attention spans, community, and the damage done by modern technology. Each era looks backward with longing toward a world it imagines was calmer, kinder, and more meaningful than the present. What's remarkable is not that any of these observations might contain some truth, but that the feeling appears with such regularity across thousands of years and dozens of very different civilizations. It suggests that nostalgia is not really a response to actual deterioration, but a permanent feature of human consciousness, a way that the mind processes the strangeness and difficulty of the present by constructing a softer version of the past. The cowboys of the American West have been so thoroughly transformed by Hollywood that separating the historical reality from the myth has become genuinely difficult. The image of the lone cowboy, rugged, silent, defined by a personal code of honor, roaming a vast and lawless frontier, is one of the most powerful archetypes in American culture. The actual work of a cowboy in the late 19th century was primarily agricultural labor. Long, exhausting, often tedious cattle drives across open land, lasting months at a time in harsh weather conditions. Cowboys were largely working-class men, many of them black or Latino, whose contributions have been systematically erased from the romantic version of the story. The cowboy life was defined less by gunfights and dramatic confrontations than by boredom, physical hardship, poor pay, and the constant demands of managing large herds of uncooperative animals. The mythology of the West served specific cultural and political purposes in American life, celebrating a vision of rugged individualism that the actual cowboys of history would barely have recognized. The word history comes from the ancient Greek word meaning inquiry or investigation, a reminder that the discipline began not as the passive recording of facts, but as an active process of questioning, examining, and trying to understand what actually happened and why. Herodotus, often called the father of history, traveled widely, interviewed people from many cultures, and explicitly noted when his sources disagreed, or when he was uncertain about the truth of what he had been told. He was not simply writing down events, he was thinking critically about evidence. This original spirit of inquiry has sometimes been forgotten in the way history is taught, where the emphasis falls on memorizing dates, names, and outcomes rather than on asking why events happened, whose perspective is being represented, and what might have been left out of the account entirely. Every fact in history was once uncertain, debated, and filtered through layers of human interpretation before it became the clean, confident sentence in a textbook. Understanding this does not make history less reliable. It makes engaging with it far more honest and far more interesting. The story of history is often told as a straight line moving forward, from primitive beginnings to increasing complexity, from ignorance to knowledge, from darkness to light. This progressive narrative is deeply comforting and has shaped the way people in many cultures think about time, civilization, and human purpose. But history as it actually happened is far less tidy. Civilizations have risen and collapsed throughout human experience, taking their knowledge, art, and systems with them. The ancient city of Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey had a population of thousands and a sophisticated social organization 9,000 years ago. The Indus Valley civilization built cities with advanced sewage systems 4,000 years ago and then disappeared, leaving almost no written records that can be read. The Roman Empire's collapse left Western Europe without many technologies and administrative systems that would not be recovered for centuries. Progress in one place and time has repeatedly coexisted with loss in another. History moves in something closer to waves than straight lines, and its direction at any given moment depends entirely on where you are standing. Throughout all of recorded history, across every culture and civilization that left written records, human beings have shared a remarkably consistent set of concerns about fairness, about death, about love, about the behavior of young people, about the quality of leadership, and about whether the world is declining or improving. A Babylonian clay tablet from approximately 4,000 years ago contains a complaint from a student about the difficulty of his studies and his wish that school were less demanding. An ancient Egyptian papyrus includes a lament that young people no longer respect their elders, a sentiment that appears again in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, medieval Europe, and virtually every subsequent era right up to the present. Love poems, grief, humor, frustration with bureaucracy, pride in craft, fear of the unknown. All of these appear in the oldest human documents with a familiarity that is both startling and deeply reassuring. The people of the past were not fundamentally different kinds of beings. They were people carrying the same essential human weight that we carry today, doing their best in worlds that were stranger and harder than ours, feeling everything that we feel now. Every myth, legend, and misconception explored across these 70 facts shares a common thread: the human need to make the world more meaningful, more dramatic, and more ordered than it often actually is. We give famous people wooden teeth and memorable last words. We build dramatic origin stories for ordinary phrases. We turn complicated, messy historical events into clean narratives with clear heroes and villains. We give ancient monuments legendary origins and famous structures impossible properties. This is not simply error or carelessness. It is a fundamental feature of how the human mind processes and stores experience. Stories that are vivid, emotionally satisfying, and structurally elegant are easier to remember and more rewarding to repeat than the complicated, partial, and often contradictory reality that historical research tends to uncover. Understanding that myths exist and why they form does not diminish the past. It enriches it, adding a second layer of meaning to every story we tell about where we came from and who we are. The myths themselves become part of the history, telling us as much about the people who invented them as about the events they were meant to explain.